Don't even say it.
I know,
I haven't got my flu shot yet.
Kids doing class last
Are
week.
you still?
Is this a lot better?
Yeah, no, it's terrible.
You're right.
All right, so
The colors aren't.
as I mentioned, this week the task of the translator is going to transition us to Baudelaire, because it is Benjamin's introduction to his translation of Baudelaire. So that means that we'll be beginning with Baudelaire, 3 weeks of Baudelaire, starting next week. So just to give you an overview of these 3 weeks, and this is our kind of introduction and kind of core readings from the Arcades Project, since the Arcades Project is centered around Baudelaire. So next week, the main reading is the very long essay by Benjamin, The Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire, which is the most extensive piece of writing that came out of the Arcades Project as a complete piece of writing by Benjamin. And then we have some references to Baudelaire, both extended versions of what is quoted by Benjamin, as well as other things that are not quoted extensively by Benjamin. And that includes not only his poetry, but also his critical writings. So the Salon of 1846 is very important. The Heroism of Modern Life with its dedication to the bourgeoisie. And then also you'll see the drafts of a preface to the Fleur de Mal, and then to the Reader, which is the opening poem. And then we'll also look at some of the late aphorisms by Baudelaire from the Paris Spleen. Okay. The second week of Baudelaire is on some motifs in Baudelaire, which is included in the Illuminations book. And that's the other essay that he wrote that is complete on Baudelaire. And finally, in the third week, we have Central Park, which is a selection of his notes from the Baudelaire folder in the Arcades Project, the convolute. So the convolutes in the Arcades Project are just his folders full of note cards. And so we'll have some selections from the note cards on Baudelaire, both his own kind of observations and some quotations from Baudelaire and his contemporaries. So the reading will get increasingly less as the 3 weeks proceed. So we'll start with a lot, and then we'll trickle down into the shorter readings. And that will set us up to jump back into the 20th century with Surrealism, where we'll start with primary text, Breton's Mad Love. Now, there is something, if I went all the way down to the Surrealism week, because we're going to look at on the mimetic faculty today. We're going to jump ahead. It's a very short piece. We're going to look at it in class today, because it relates to the language question, but also needed to be read after you read the other stuff. Volunteers for next time? Pablo, you had mentioned? Okay. So a second volunteer for the Paris of the Second Empire and Baudelaire?
So there's a lot of reading. Can I only cover that? Or
Yeah.
do you want me to do notes for the poems and everything too? I'll read them, but I don't
No,
know.
just
chance to
you can
make
focus.
notes out of them.
Yeah, you can focus on the Benjamin.
Okay.
Yeah, on the Benjamin essay. That would be great. Second volunteer next time. Paris of the Second Empire and Baudelaire.
I'll do the next week. I have to do the weeks where I don't have kids, so I'll do the following.
So you're not doing next week. You're going to do the following week. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah.
So you'll have to remind me about
I
that.
can do next week.
Okay, great. Okay, good. All right. All right. So let's. Since I mentioned it. Let's start with on the mimetic faculty. Which we'll read together now in class. So this is where he makes it clear that he disagrees with semiotics. So we're gonna, in dealing with Benjamin, we're gonna have to leave aside everything we've been miseducated on about language and semiotics, structuralism, kind of everything. Just all of it, just leave it all out because it's not what Benjamin thinks. So in order for us to get at what Benjamin thinks, we have to clear our heads of all that stuff. Also theories of representation, that's also, forget that, all that stuff, just garbage. As far as Benjamin is concerned. So we're on this lifeboat with Benjamin. Drifting in deep space, we got nothing else. Okay. All right. Also other theories of mimesis, forget that. Whatever other theories of mimesis, Eric Auerbach, whatever, no. Now he is going to be in dialogue with semiotics, also with anthropology, but we'll see how he uses anthropological categories. Nature creates similarities. One need only think of mimicry. The highest capacity for producing similarities, however, is man's. His gift of seeing resemblances is nothing other than a rudiment of the powerful compulsion in former times to become and behave like something else. I'm actually going to use a different translation. Yeah, there is a different translation. There's a translation from the selected writings that might be a little bit better, actually. The one that rolls off my tongue a little bit better. I want to make sure that we have some keywords. Okay. His gift for seeing similarity is nothing but a rudiment of the once powerful compulsion to become similar and to behave mimetically. There is perhaps not a single one of his higher functions in which his mimetic faculty does not play a decisive role. This faculty has a history, however. Remember the name of the course? Benjamin in history, future of the subject. So history and subject, really important. Faculty has a history, however, in both the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic sense. So in its origin and in its development. As regards the latter, play is to a great extent at school. Children's play is everywhere permeated by mimetic modes of behavior, and its realm is by no means limited to what one person can imitate in another person. The child plays at being not only a shopkeeper or teacher, but also a windmill and a train. Of what use to him is the schooling of his mimetic faculty. So notice, to become similar is also to change. It's a transformative process, meaning when the child imitates a windmill or a train, they're anthropomorphizing the technology, like Thomas the Train or cars or planes. You know this stuff, yes. You were raised on this stuff, no? The animated movies, yeah. But also not only anthropomorphizing the technology, but also technologizing the child. So mimesis is transformative, changes both the subject and the object. So what use to him is the schooling of his mimetic faculty. The answer presupposes an understanding of the phylogenetic significance of the mimetic faculty. Here it is not enough to think of what we understand today by the concept of similarity. As is known, the sphere of life that formerly seemed to be governed by the law of similarity was comprehensive. It ruled both microcosm and macrocosm. But these natural correspondences are given their true importance only if we see that they, one and all, are stimulants and awakeners of the mimetic faculty which answers them in man. It must be borne in mind that neither mimetic powers nor mimetic objects remain the same in the course of thousands of years. Rather, we must suppose that the gift for producing similarities, for example in dances, whose oldest function this is, and therefore also the gift of recognizing them, have changed in the course of history. The direction of this change seems determined by the increasing fragility of the mimetic faculty. For clearly the perceptual world of modern man contains only minimal residues of the magical correspondences and analogies that were familiar to ancient peoples. The question is whether we are concerned with the decay of this faculty or with its transformation. Of the direction in which the latter might lie, some indications may be derived, even if indirectly, from astrology. We must assume in principle that in the remote past, the processes considered imitable included those in the sky. In dance, on other cultic occasions, such imitation could be produced, such similarity dealt with. But if the mimetic genius was really a life-determining force for the ancients, it is not difficult to imagine that the newborn child was thought to be in full possession of this gift, and in particular to be perfectly adapted to the form of cosmic being. Allusion to the astrological sphere may supply a first reference point for an understanding of the concept of non-sensuous similarity. Non-sensuous similarity, that's actually the core concept in this piece. Non-sensuous similarity. So I'll illustrate it by way of astrology. So I'm a Virgo, of course. So is my mother. So I'm a neurotic, whatever. So what does it mean to be a Virgo? It means to have been born under the sign of Virgo. Right, so some alignment of the heavenly bodies, the constellation Virgo. Somehow I am like the constellation Virgo, meaning in astrology the different stars have their significance, and then the constellation gives you a kind of character structure or kind of personality matrix. So I am like the constellation Virgo in terms of the cosmic powers that the constellation represents, but I don't look like the constellation Virgo. So I'm like the constellation Virgo, but in a non-sensuous way. Non-sensuous similarity. And I bring up constellation because constellation is a really important concept in both constellation and construction. So with the experience and poverty piece that we read, we came across the term construction. Here we're going to have the term constellation, and the fact that he brings up astrology and constellation is not accidental. All right, so non-sensuous similarity. So art, literature, any kind of objectification might be a product of mimesis, but in a non-sensuous way. Okay, so let's see what he says. True, our existence no longer includes what once made it possible to speak of this kind of similarity, above all the ability to produce it. Nevertheless, we too possess a canon according to which the meaning of non-sensuous similarity can at least be partly clarified, and this canon is language. From time immemorial, the mimetic faculty has been conceded some influence on language, yet this was done without foundation, without considering of a further meaning, still less a history of the mimetic faculty. But above all, such considerations remain closely tied to the commonplace, sensuous realm of similarity. While the same imitative behavior in language formation was acknowledged under the name of onomatopoeia. Now, if language, as is evident to the insightful, is not an agreed-upon system of signs, ding, 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 not an agreed-upon system of signs, semiotics, goodbye. Then, we will, in attempting to approach language, be constantly obliged to have recourse to the kind of thoughts that appear in their most primitive form as the onomatopoeic mode of explanation. The question is whether this can be developed and adapted to improved understanding. Every word in the whole of language, it has been asserted, is onomatopoeic. So this is the idea that words sound like their object. It is difficult to conceive in any detail the program that might be implied by this proposition. But the concept of non-sensuous similarity is of some relevance. For if words meaning the same thing in different languages are arranged about that signified as their center, we have to inquire how they all, while often possessing not the slightest similarity to one another, are similar to the signified at their center. Yet this kind of similarity cannot be explained only by the relationships between words meaning the same thing in different languages, just as in general our reflections cannot be restricted to the spoken word. They are equally concerned with the written word. And here it is noteworthy that the latter, in some cases perhaps more vividly than the spoken word, illuminates, by the relation of its written form to the signified, the nature of non-sensuous similarity. In brief, it is non-sensuous similarity that establishes the ties not only between what is said and what is meant, but also between what is written and what is meant, and equally between the spoken and the written. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying, if the spoken word sounds like its object, but non-sensuously, the written word looks like its object, but non-sensuously, the spoken word sounds like the written word, and the written word looks like the spoken word. All right, so how does...
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah.
Like if the spoken word
sounds like its object, then the written word looks like its object, but the spoken word sounds like the written word looks, and the written word looks like the spoken word sounds. Right, so what we're talking about is like, I don't know, synesthesia or non-sensuous similarity. Non-sensuous similarity. This is the difficult part. Non-sensuous similarity. So imitating, but not sensuously. Graphology has taught us to recognize in handwriting images that the unconscious of the writer conceals in it. It may be supposed that the mimetic process which expresses itself in this way in the activity of the writer was, in the very distant times in which script originated, of utmost importance for writing. Script has thus become, like language, an archive of non-sensuous similarity, of non-sensuous correspondences. So language is a canon, it's an archive, so what do you need a canon and an archive for? To give you history. So why does he disagree with semiotics? So for semiotics, there's an arbitrary or conventional relationship between the signified and the signifier, whereas for Benjamin, there's a historical relationship between the signified and the signifier. So in semiotics, you lose history. That's why it's not good. And the historical relationship between the signified and the signifier changes. I think that I mentioned that Benjamin, as a Nietzschean, similar to Nietzsche was a philologist, so he's trained in ancient languages and in exegesis of scripture and literature. So tracking minute changes in word usage and in grammatical form and syntactical idiomatic expressions becomes very important for understanding ancient texts because they didn't use language the way we do.
So semiotics is like static.
Yeah, it's ahistorical. It just gives you one damn thing after another. Meaning it gives you this arrangement and that arrangement and the other arrangement, but it doesn't give you how they become each other, how they change historically. It loses the sense of historical transformation, which is of utmost importance to Benjamin. Why? Because he's interested in transforming capitalism historically, getting out of the situation that we're in. Marxism. But this aspect of language as well as of script does not develop in isolation from its other semiotic aspect. Rather, the mimetic element in language can, like a flame, manifest itself only through a kind of bearer. This bearer is the semiotic element. Thus, the nexus of meaning of words or sentences is the bearer through which, like a flash, similarity appears. So the kind of logical, semiotical form of language is like the wick of a candle. For its production by man, like its perception by him, is in many cases, and particularly the most important, tied to its flashing up. It flits past. It is not improbable that the rapidity of writing and reading heightens the fusion of the semiotic and the mimetic in the sphere of language. So when we're reading quietly to ourselves, right? We're hearing the words, we're seeing the reference, and there's like a fusion of the auditory, the visual, and the linguistic. To read what was never written. Okay, so what was never written, there's two senses of that. One is that it wasn't written by anyone, so maybe it was, namely God. Or it wasn't written because it hasn't been written yet. Right, can we read what hasn't been written yet? So again, introduce the kind of historical dimension. Such reading is the most ancient. Reading prior to all languages. From entrails, the stars, or dances. Later, the mediating link of a new kind of reading, of runes and hieroglyphs, came into use. It seems fair to suppose that those were the stages by which the mimetic gift, formerly the foundation of occult practices, gained admittance to writing and language. In this way, language may be seen as the highest level of mimetic behavior and the most complete archive of non-sensuous similarity, a medium into which the earlier powers of mimetic production and comprehension have passed without residue to the point where they have liquidated those of magic. Okay, so he brings up the occult, cultic practices, and the occult. So what's the difference between cult and occult? Cult is religion, occult is magic. So there's a basic anthropological distinction between religion and magic. So religion is about worshiping the divine powers, venerating. It's about the sacred and the profane, and we're going to look at that in a second with theologico-political fragment. So religion is about the sacred, magic is about the profane. So magic is not about worshiping or venerating the cosmic powers, it's trying to manipulate them, trying to instrumentalize them. And of course, that's why magic always has the taint of evil, as opposed to religion.
I also have a question about this residue.
About which?
About
What's the word?
residue.
Residue. Uh-huh.
I mean, can you elaborate that? Like, what residue? Like,
Oh, that there's something left
what is the
over.
context of it?
So it would be that, so liquidation here doesn't mean elimination. It means fully translating from one form into another. Right, so you liquidate your assets. You sell a home and you get whatever money and then you get the full value. Right. So that's all that he means by that. Meaning that mimetic, so language has completely absorbed magic. All right, so a couple of things to say about this in terms of, well, all sorts of things. So first of all, you could be killed for using words the wrong way by religious authorities, blasphemy. All right, so if you blaspheme, dead. Okay, also, often people didn't tell each other their true names because you don't want a magician to know your name. Because if a magician knows your name, they can have power over you. Okay, so language is very powerful. That's what people have always thought. They thought language is powerful. Language gives power over things, right? Now, he's talking about mimesis. He's talking about correspondences, relations. So mimesis is a way that we relate to things. And we relate to things in such a way that, again, the subject and the object change each other in that relation. So mimesis is a way of thinking about how in the relation of subject and object, both the object and the subject are changed, are affected. Right, so when we speak of something, we're relating to it. We're in relation to it. Right? The relation between the signified and the signifier. That's really important. So the idea that the signifier has power over the signified but also that the signified has power over the signifier. Right? Mimetic objects affect the mimetic faculty, and neither have remained the same for thousands of years. The subject and the object have changed across history. The relation between subject and object has changed across history. That's really the point. The point is that the relation between subject and object has changed, and that we can get a sense of that by looking at this canon or this archive of language. It gives us a historical index of those changes, how we've changed in our relations to things, how we've changed because we've changed our relation to things. All right, so dances, right? Rain dance, the rain dance. What's the point of the rain dance? To try to make it rain. Right, it's to affect something very important for...
Is he seeing here dance as a language, or language is just like our spoken written word?
Well, we'll see. On languages such in languages, man, like everything could be understood as a language, right? So every form could be considered a language, including...
But only if we name it.
Only if we name it. Now, in previous weeks, I know that I've seemed to have gone off the deep end with you guys, like Yahweh and, I am that I am. No, we talked about that, yes. God, right? Oh, no, it's very important, yes. And now everything is scripture. Where does language originate? Right? That's the question. Where does language originate? So for most ancient peoples, and probably for us as well, although we have this funny Tower of Babel kind of myth in the Bible, but the assumption is that language comes from God. Comes from the gods. It comes from the divine forces, meaning they give us language. So language comes before being, seemingly. So the question is, why would anyone ever think that? Meaning, of course, Homo sapiens existed before language. Meaning, there is a point in history when the human species, Homo sapiens, invents language. I think that I mentioned to you guys the human revolution, like the kind of anthropological breakthrough. The human revolution, either 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, when humans invented two things at once, religion and language. Also art, but that's because art was religion. Now, I mentioned magic and religion. Okay, so science. Science versus religion. Oh, why are science and religion opposed to each other, ever, at all? Because science descends from religion. From magic. Science descends from magic. So there is something about science where we're trying to understand things in a way that maybe God didn't intend. We're trying to manipulate things in a way that God didn't intend. But this raised the question of art and literature. Are art and literature, when they leave the realm of religion, do they enter the realm of magic? Do they enter the realm of science? And there's a tension between knowledge and relation to the divine. Right, so we are going to talk about this on language as such in the language of man, namely Adam and Eve, Adamic language, Adam, the language of Adam. So if God created the world by speaking, but also created himself by speaking, brought all being into existence, brought himself into existence, I am that I am. Well, he created Adam, and then Adam became a kind of co-creator of the world. Right? He allowed Adam to name things. In Eden, in paradise. So, you guys know Adam and Eve story? Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Adam and Eve. right? So Eve seduced Adam into breaking the one rule that God had, which is Garden of Eden, this is all for you, except don't eat the fruit from the forbidden tree of knowledge. And she was also seduced by the serpent, whatever that means, into eating from the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge. And they did so, and as punishment, kicked out of Eden, and that's when mortality, disease, biological reproduction, and time itself was introduced. History was introduced. So history begins with the expulsion from paradise, because in paradise there's no time, there's no history, there's no change, there's no mortality, there's no ephemerality, there's no temporality. Okay, so they also, though, part of the punishment of knowledge, right, is losing that original language. So Adam and Eve lost that original Adamic language. They lost the true name of things. Why do we invent these stories for ourselves? What does it mean, right? Because it means something. It obviously means something, right? That our names for things, we've known this for thousands of years. Our names for things are not the true names of things. Why? How? What? So the true names of things would be permanent, unchanging, eternal. Our names for things change, or a function of history.
Our names of things, like true names of things, are eternal. In perception of human,
Perception of?
like in perception of a specific species.
Uh-huh.
Right? So it's a very confusing factor that there is actually a existence of a true name.
Right. So it's a paradoxical thing, because of course there isn't, and yet we do tell ourselves that there is, but that we don't have access to it. Right, so the idea is that we think that there is a true name for things that only God knows, and we no longer know. We once knew, but we no longer know. Right, so really what we're talking about is we knew the true name of things before we had language. So having language somehow divorces us from things, alienates us from things. Right? Because that's what the expulsion from Eden is. It's alienation. Right? It's alienation from nature, alienation from God, alienation from each other, alienation from language. Now, why am I going through all this? Because anthropology, archaeology, biblical exegesis, philology, like everything that we're talking about now would have been baseline assumptions for all of Benjamin's readers as well as for Benjamin himself. Like this is just sort of basic theology. Right, this would just be common education for people. Of course, when fewer people were educated, but nonetheless. Right? So we've lost sight of this because we think that we take our atheism for granted, let's put it that way. We should not. Meaning, I think that I might have mentioned this in an earlier class, we need to understand what the rational object of the concept of God is. Meaning, if we take our atheism too much for granted, we might think that religion is irrational. It's not. It's not at all irrational. It means something, it's reason. It's the first form of reason. It's the reason that got us thousands of years along. And religious people today, it's reason. That's what it is. It's reason. It's not irrationality. It's reason. So again, we can't take, the kind of You're either scientific or you're religious. You're either reasoning or you're not reasoning. You're either reasoning or you're irrational. No. No. So I mentioned the connection between magic and science. Magic was reason too. I don't know if you guys know this about Newton, Sir Isaac Newton. He wrote more on alchemy than he did on science. So alchemy we think of as magic. No, it's science. It's the same thing. It's science. Magic was science. Religion was reason. It's the product of our reason, but it's the product of our reason in the way that our reason is actually the product of alienation. Our reason is the product of alienation. Meaning, animals have cognition, they have perception, they have memory, they can think. There is some kind of cognitive faculty and consciousness there, but not like humans, not like humans. So we have reason in a way that the animals don't, but our reason is tied to our alienation. The animals don't have reason because they're not alienated. We are. Now, of course, when Adam and Eve, when they were kicked out of paradise, they introduced mortality and ephemerality and suffering into not only the human condition, but the condition of nature itself. Right? That when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, they made all of God's creation suffer the same fate as them. Us into the other piece, which is the theologico-political fragment. This is going to be important when we come around at the end of the course to on the concept of history, the piece that all of our readings are taking us to that destination. Only the Messiah himself consummates all history, in the sense that he alone redeems, completes, creates its relation to the Messianic. For this reason, nothing historical can relate itself on its own account to anything Messianic. Okay, so what is this? Well, mention the beginning of history, or really before history, which is the Garden of Eden. All right, so God's kingdom comes at the end of history. So at the end of history, there will be an end to time. There will be an end to history, an end to time. And the kingdom of God that the Messiah brings about will be without disease, aging, suffering of any kind, mortality, death, biological reproduction. And not only that, and we'll get to it a little bit later in this piece, so everything that has ever lived will be resurrected. Not only all humans who have ever lived will be resurrected in their bodies, but also all of nature will be resurrected. So that's what it means to say that it will be redeemed. So it will be somehow repaired.
So there is no concept of incarnation?
No. No, not like that, no. There's just, there's, no, not reincarnation, no. Just before time, at the end of time. And in between, we have time, we have history. At least in the way that he's talking about it. Therefore, the kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be set as a goal. So why? Because it's outside of history, it's outside of time. All right, so religion has a notion of history and time, which is that there's a before time and after time. And then time is the period of basically the fall. The fall from, the expulsion from Eden, the fall from paradise. From the standpoint of history, it is not the goal, but the end. Therefore, the order of the profane cannot be built up on the idea of the divine kingdom, and therefore theocracy has no political, but only a religious meaning. To have repudiated with utmost vehemence the political significance of theocracy is the cardinal merit of Bloch's spirit of utopia. That's Ernst Bloch, he's a friend of his. Another one who converts to Marxism. So notice, repudiated with utmost vehemence. Right, this is the thing. Benjamin is not theocratic, certainly. Also not theological in the sense of just assuming it. No. Why? Because he's concerned with the profane. So we talked about the sacred and the profane, the religious and the magical. Okay, so sacred and profane, very important distinction, anthropological distinction. All cultures ever have made a distinction between the sacred and the profane. The order of the profane should be erected on the idea of happiness. The relation of this order to the messianic is one of the essential teachings of the philosophy of history. It is the precondition of a mystical conception of history containing a problem that can be represented figuratively. If one arrow points to the goal towards which the profane dynamic acts, and another marks the direction of messianic intensity, then certainly the quest of free humanity for happiness runs counter to the messianic direction. But just as a force can, through acting, increase another that is acting in the opposite direction, so the order of the profane assists, through being profane, the coming of the messianic kingdom. All right, so let's unpack this one. So, first of all, let's do this. So we have the messianic or the sacred, and we have profane. Right, so this would be happiness, quest of free humanity for happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what is messianic? It's about redemption. Redemption of what? We will see redemption of unhappiness. Ancient, now let's do the modern. The profane, therefore, although not itself a category of this kingdom, is a decisive category of its quietist approach. For in happiness, all that is earthly seeks its downfall, and only in good fortune is its downfall destined to find it. Whereas admittedly, the immediate messianic intensity of the heart, of the inner man in isolation, passes through misfortune as suffering. To the spiritual restitutio in integrum, that's the bodily restoration, which introduces immortality, corresponds a worldly restitution that leads to the eternity of downfall, and the rhythm of this eternally transient worldly existence, transient in its totality, in its spatial but also in its temporal totality, the rhythm of messianic nature is happiness. For nature is messianic by reason of its eternal and total passing away. To strive after such passing, even for those ages of man that are nature, is the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism. Okay, so the issue is suffering. And so there are two kinds of suffering. There's suffering from unhappiness, and then messianic redemption means that we will be happy at the end of time in a way that in this time we were not happy. So why are we resurrected in our bodies? To have bodily happiness that we didn't have in life. So the modern is the historical. And then the issue is what needs to be redeemed in the historical dynamic. Not unhappiness, but unfreedom. Meaning in history, and he means a Marxist, he's a Hegelian. What is history? It is the struggle for freedom, motivated by the pursuit of happiness. Struggle for freedom. And history is the redemption of that struggle for freedom. It's progress in consciousness of freedom, to use Hegel's phrase. It's not the attainment of happiness, because happiness is a matter of fortune and misfortune. Right? So history cannot redeem unhappiness. History cannot redeem unhappiness. The dead are dead. Suffering can't be undone. History can't redeem unhappiness. Religion promises to redeem unhappiness by bringing the dead back at the end of time. But within history, within the historical dynamic, what can be redeemed, what kind of suffering can be redeemed? The suffering of unfreedom. Not the suffering from unhappiness, but the suffering from unfreedom. So I will also say, use some other language here. So the sacred, the messianic, the celestial, so this is some language from Christianity. The celestial versus the secular. So why is the sacred celestial? Because it's eternal. Secular means temporal. So celestial authority, the authority of the church, versus secular authority, the authority of politics. 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 World politics. World politics. What is world politics? Socialism, the struggle for socialism. World politics. This method must be called nihilism because it seeks the passing of nature. So Engels famously, in his most well-read book, probably the most well-read book of Marxism before the Russian Revolution, was Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. So it wasn't the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto was resurrected and turned into a canonical thing after the Russian Revolution. It was Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, and in it, Engels quoted Goethe from Faust, Mephistopheles, all that exists deserves to perish. All that exists deserves to perish. Nihilism. The task of world politics is to bring about such passing. All that exists deserves to perish. The only question is whether it perishes in a way that can redeem unfreedom, or whether the perishing only suggests the religious redemption of unhappiness. Because of course, humans die. They suffer, they die. Misfortune, good fortune. To live is to suffer and to die. The only question is, what are we dying for?
he draw nihilism from Nietzsche? Or why nihilism?
I would say it's more general than Nietzsche, but certainly Nietzsche thought that the nihilism of the modern world was a task. Right, the modern world was experiencing nihilism, maybe the greatest nihilism that had ever been experienced, because its task was the greatest, historically, ever. Right, so of course, Benjamin agreed with Nietzsche that this was the case, that we suffer from a nihilism that ancient peoples never did suffer from the nihilism that we suffer from. We suffer from a deep, profound, total existential nihilism that ancient peoples never did. Why? Because we're faced with a task that the ancients were never faced with, namely to produce the overman as opposed to becoming the last man. Okay, and how does Benjamin understand that? This is socialism, overcoming capitalism. Capitalism is the greatest crisis in history, bringing with it the greatest nihilism of history, but that's interpreted as indicating a task. It's not a wrong turn, it's not a dead end, it's not a mistake, it's a task.
And can we connect that to experience and poetry?
Yep.
So, like this idea of barbarian that destroys everything, like this nihilistic persona, yeah?
Another Nietzsche phrase comes to mind, which is, if something is fallen, give it a push. Which sounds mean, but it's not about that. It's about whether, again, experience. Remember, experience, we have two different senses of experience. The thing that we make happen versus the thing that happens to us. So being the subject of experience versus being the object of experience. So if something is fallen, give it a push, so you become an agent, so you become a subject, right? Capitalism is always collapsing. It's always falling. It's always self-destructing. But remember the fire alarm piece from One Way Street? The question is whether the proletariat brings about the end of capitalism or whether capitalism just brings about its own end. And if it just brings about its own end, then what do we have? Inflation and poison gas. Remember? Like what have we had since Benjamin's time when he was alive? We've had a lot of self-destruction of capitalism. We've had a lot of mass genocidal warfare, a lot of poison gas, even though poison gas is forbidden. We've had the equivalent of it. And of course, we've had the constant destruction of the working class through inflation.
Inflation and nukes.
And nukes, inflation and nukes. But we haven't used nukes since World War II either. So we haven't used poison gas since World War I, except in the concentration camps. And we haven't used nukes since World War II. Or did the Chinese use nukes to level a mountain, to do some earth moving? Did that happen? I think that might have happened. Meaning it wasn't used in war, but it was used for something else. Because we gotta keep that muscle toned in case we need to use it. No, it will happen. You know, of course, there will probably be some nuclear war at some point because we're not getting socialism. Doesn't look like we're getting socialism. Nobody's doing anything in that direction. Nobody's striving for the passing in world politics whose method must be called no. We're not doing it. At least not yet. Okay, so this is why we might be thinking about the Garden of Eden. Right, so Adamic language, you know, like fundamental alienation, this kind of thing, as well as history. But Benjamin was not nearly as pessimistic as we are. I just want you guys to understand that. Benjamin was not as pessimistic as we are, not at all. On language as such and language of man. Let me bring up the notes. All right, let's look at the beginning of language as such and language of man. See how he sets it up. Every expression of human mental life can be understood as a kind of language. And this understanding in the manner of a true method everywhere raises new questions. That's an important thing to maybe pause on. A true method is not about answering, but rather raising new questions. It is possible to talk about a language of music and of sculpture, about a language of justice, that has nothing directly to do with those in which German or English legal judgments are couched, about a language of technology that is not the specialized language of technicians. Language in such contexts means the tendency inherent in the subjects concerned, technology, art, justice, or religion, towards the communication of mental meanings. To sum up, all communication of mental meanings is language. Communication in words being only a particular case of human language, and of the justice, poetry, or whatever underlying it, or founded on it. The existence of language, however, is not only coextensive with all the areas of human mental expression, in which language is always in one sense or another inherent, but with absolutely everything. There is no event or thing in either animate or inanimate nature that does not in some way partake of language. For it is in the nature of all to communicate their mental meanings. This use of the word language is in no way metaphorical. For to think that we cannot imagine anything that does not communicate its mental nature in its expression is entirely meaningful. The greater or lesser degree of consciousness that is apparently or really involved in such communication cannot alter the fact that we cannot imagine a total absence of language in anything. An existence entirely without relationship to language is an idea, but this idea can bear no fruit, even within that realm of ideas whose circumference defines the idea of God. Okay, so I mentioned relation, right? So relation between signified and signifier. And I think, have we talked about social relations before? I don't know if we did social relations, okay. Again, kind of anthropology. Right, this is a term that Marx uses that is taken from Saint-Simon, the utopian socialist, and also from Auguste Comte, who was a breakaway follower of Saint-Simon, and who is the inventor of sociology and of positivism. So social relations. So social relations are relations to and with others. So of course that's the most obvious way that we think about social relations, relations between people. But no, it means more than that. It means relations to and with nature, so everything that exists, to the extent, including history. Everything that's come into being. And it's also relations to and with oneself. So social relations are cosmological, meaning they are the logic of the cosmos. So they're meant to embrace all the ways that we relate to everything, including ourselves. And of course, social relations, the first form of social relations are religion. And in religious cosmology, everything is related to everything else. So how is everything related to everything else? Because they're all God's creation. So they're all created by God, and therefore they all have a relation to each other, to everything else, and that is their relation to and with God is expressed in the relations of everything to everything else. Now, did we encounter the word monad yet? I don't know if we did. We did. Okay, so monad. The reason that I bring this up is that there's a concept that this is related to the monadological and the prismatic. Right. So this is Leibniz is a Protestant theologian and philosopher, and he wrote a book called Monadology. And it's basically an atomic theory of matter as well as a theory of the soul. So the idea is that everything is composed of monads, including the soul is a monad. And it's a windowless monad. So everything is a monad in the sense that everything is created by God. It's a windowless monad because that relation to God is not necessarily expressed directly through relation to other things, but only via God. And meaning that God knows the meaning of all things, knows the meaning and purpose of all things, and also understands the relation of all things in a way that none of God's creations know that. They only know their relationship to God, they don't know their relation to each other. God knows the whole thing. We only know our relation to God. And we only know that not through any empirical evidence, but only in the depths of our soul. So that's why it's a windowless monad. And actually, not only we, but everything in the universe only knows its existence through its relationship to God, not through its relations to other things. That would appear to be the opposite of this social relations idea. Now, I mentioned Comte. Positivism. And this is comes out of utopian socialism. So he thought that the first way we have of relating to things and understanding things, therefore, so we understand things in the way that we relate to them, the first form of that was religion. But then that, over thousands of years, religion became metaphysics, became philosophy, and then finally philosophy, after further thousands of years, became what he calls the positive sciences. And the positive sciences are based on empirical observation. So religion and theology ask the question of, we're looking at anomalies, we're looking at phenomena, and we're asking the question, why did this happen? Why did God make it this way? Then metaphysics gets us into the question of how things are, like the laws of the universe, the laws of creation. But then the positive sciences are based on empirical observation, meaning it's concerned with what it is we're observing. So not with the why or the how, but the what. So are we observing anything at all? What are we observing? Are we observing anything at all? And that what should have been the first question is the last question. Right? So before you can answer how and why, you have to start with what. But we started why and then moved through how and then finally arrived at what. Okay. So windowless monad and Benjamin's notion of the monad monadological approach, but also the prismatic approach. So this is the illumination, and he calls it profane illumination. We'll get there. Profane illumination. This is the idea that, like a prism, hold on. So the monad is the microcosm. So each monad is a microcosm, and then the question is, how does the microcosm relate to the macrocosm? And of course, that's through God. But each of God's creations, down to the tiniest atom, is all of God's creation. Right, so everything that God has created is itself all of God's creation. Right, so the microcosm idea, that all of God's creation in a macrocosmic sense is reproduced within the microcosm. Each bit of God's creation. All right, so, but not illuminated from without, but illuminated from within, with the microcosmic relation. So the profane illumination of the prismatic, then you mean, is like the prism, so the light goes in and then it bends and refracts. Okay, so the idea is that through the monad treated as prismatical, we can illuminate the macrocosm via a microcosm. Right, so you can, we also call this the micrological approach. So everything in capitalism exemplifies the total situation of capitalism. Can be used to illuminate the total situation of capitalism. So there's a distinction between these two things there. There's some contradiction but a related idea. All right, so again, this older idea can be used nonetheless to grasp or illuminate the modern situation. He used, let's see, expression, communication, and then he also used expression. I thought that he used another word that's important. Have we talked about the Erscheinung? Did we do the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena? We did. Okay, so Erscheinung, the phenomenon, but also the semblance, the appearance. Right, so Erscheinung, so shining forth, the idea that phenomena are semblances or appearances. So I think that earlier in the course I mentioned that rather than representation, the concept is expression. So something doesn't represent something, it expresses it. Mm-hmm.
I have two questions about that.
Yeah.
The first is, the prismatic is basically going from the particular to the universal. So like, our particular cases can show us universal illumination,
Yep, that's right.
because everything is made from the same substance, so we can
Right.
like understand each other, like
Right.
in our ontology.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And the other question is about the monad. Isn't it the same as monism in Spinoza? Like everything's created God, everything is God, so everything just like the
Yes. Well, yes. It's roughly contemporary with Spinoza too, Leibniz.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember who's in dialogue with whom, who's responding to whom, because they are responding to each other, I think.
Okay.
I think that there's some response there. So there's actually a kind of a debate there. So monism means that there's just one thing, right? So the question is, if there's just one thing, then why are there different things? I will also say, because I have to bring up Heidegger, because we have language as a technology. That's the Heidegger approach. Benjamin's approach is different from that. But the reason I'll bring up Heidegger in this instance is because Heidegger's dissertation was on Duns Scotus. And Duns Scotus is a medieval scholastic, pre-scholastic medieval theologian, Christian theologian, whose main concept is the univocity of being. So the univocity of being is that all of God's creation speaks a different language, but all together they speak the same language. So all the different languages, all the particular expressions are nonetheless all speaking with God's voice. So everything speaks with God's voice, except it's different voices, but it's all God's voice. Does that help?
Yeah, but you see, you said Heidegger sees language as technology.
Yeah, and the reason that that's important is because the issue of alienation, how we think of language as an expression or as a phenomenon of alienation. Heidegger is in dialogue with Marxism, he is. So when he wrote on Duns Scotus, he was not, but when he wrote what we read by Heidegger, he's definitely in dialogue with Marxism, and he's rejecting Marxism. And he's rejecting Marxism as the embrace of technology as opposed to recognizing the alienation of technology. Because the Marxism that he's responding to seems to be a kind of technological determinist Marxism, rather than technology is a social relation. So if you remember to the planetarium, technology is not the mastery of nature, but a mastery of the relation to nature. We analogized it to education, where education is not the mastery of children, but the mastery of the relationship between the generations. Right, so Heidegger basically thinks that Marxism is just about letting technology loose, right? Like just total alienation, basically. So he's against Marxism because it would appear to be just the unleashing of pure technological alienation. Of course, that's not true. That's not true with Marx and Engels and Marxists. No, no. That's Heidegger's like tendentious reading, although it appears to be the case. So technology is a relation. In the Marxist view. Right, so technology is a relation, but it might be a alienated relation. Right, so that's why we might have this kind of what Heidegger decried as the worshiping of technology. So the worshiping of technology would be kind of either you could do it positively or negatively. You could either say that technology is the cause of all of our problems, or that technology is going to be the solution to all of our problems. Whereas, of course, technology is just an alienated expression of our alienated social relations. So the way Marx picks this up is in the early writing of his, but then he develops it later in Das Kapital, but the early writing of the economic and philosophic manuscripts, he says that there are 4 kinds of alienation. that occur in capitalism: alienation between people, alienation from nature, and alienation from ourselves. And then the fourth is alienation from the product of our labor. And the product of our labor is itself under the social relation, not the physical product of our labor, but the social relation that results from our labor. And that's capital. So capital is alienated labor because it's the alienated social relation of labor. Production becomes alienated in capitalism. That's the fourth kind of alienation, but it affects the other relations as well. His hand was just up.
Did you say technology is an alienated expression of our alienated social relations?
Yeah, technology is an expression of our alienated social relations, meaning technology is a phenomenon. It's not like a thing. Technology doesn't do anything itself, right? Although we might fetishize it in its reified appearance, we might turn technology into a thing as if it exists apart from us. It doesn't. Obviously, it only exists because of us. It is us. We're going to encounter this. Benjamin calls technology a prosthesis. Yeah, technology is a prosthesis. Right, so if the prosthesis is hurting us, it's because we have a pathological relation to it, meaning we're not using it right, or we're not, we haven't mastered it. Right? But again, to the planetarium. Okay, so language. Language is also a prosthesis. Language is us. It is us. And yet we're alienated from it. Now, I'll bring in one other thing about alienation here, which is so Kant had this idea of a progress of knowledge, but from a Marxist perspective, because we did the Dialectical-political phenomena, so we did the three appearances of freedom: religion, art, philosophy, Hegel, also Nietzsche, has that same tripartite structure, because it's broader than either of them. For Kant, this is the forms of knowledge, but you could also call them forms of alienation. In other words, the first way in which we understand our freedom is nonetheless in an alienated form, meaning we attribute our freedom to God. Right, so rather than being our own action, it's God's action. Right, so we made huge changes in our history, in our social relations, in our cosmology, but we always attributed it to a divine intervention, meaning the coming of a prophet who was telling us something that God wanted us to know. No, it was ourselves doing that and telling ourselves that. It wasn't like a message from God, it was a message from us, but in alienated form. Similarly, philosophy for Marx and Marxism is in a form of alienation, meaning we attribute to metaphysical things what is, in fact, our own doing. And then the question of science is important because, of course, in capitalism we only have the science that capitalism conditions. We don't have science. We have science as we have it in our alienated social relations. So we have a distorted form of science due to capitalism, because beyond capitalism, for Marxists, would be a transformed science. Whereas the science we have now is alienated. And that's why the science we have now is actually inseparable from preceding forms of alienation. Metaphysics, religion. That's why we can have science-ism. We can believe in science like people believe in religion, which is an absurdity taken at one level. At another level, it makes perfect sense why we would put science in the place of religion. Because what else do we have? All right, so I say all of this because is Benjamin doing scientific linguistics, so scientific theory of language? It would appear not. What is he doing? He's doing some weird theology. He's doing anthropology. He's doing anthropology. Right, so, and anthropology is, you know, a modern science, Wissenschaft. And it's, the anthropological approach to language is a little bit different from the semiotic approach to language, because the semiotic, or strictly linguistic, including structural linguistics, is a kind of internal, like you look at how language works logically, you look at how it functions, and that's your science of language. But it leaves out where language came from. And also, maybe it's gone through qualitative developments, qualitative changes, qualitative transformations. It's not just been, well, this is how language works, and looking at all languages in the world and figuring out the logic that they all have in common, and then making anthropological assumptions about human cognition based on that. So it's 20th century structural linguistics is related to structural anthropology. With Claude Lévi-Strauss. So the idea that like everything is binary, right? It all goes back to the sacred versus profane distinction, and the gender distinction is related to that, because women are associated with the profane. Children? Yes? That's why women have to be kept away from sacred things, because they might pollute them. So binaristic, like male-female, sacred-profane. Actually, no. That's a 20th century projection onto history, because it's not actually accurate. It's not actually the case that things are just like that. No. And that's why it's like, you know, like mind-boggling. Oh, third sex. What the hell is that? Right? Which turns out all ancient cultures also all have that idea. They have the idea of like sexual dimorphism, but they all also have the idea of the third sex. So what are you going to do with that? Structuralism? Oh. So that's why structuralism, no. No, structural linguistics, no. Structuralism, no, and also post-structuralism, no. Because post-structuralism is like a false response to a false thing. So this is why I say French fries, no. Freedom fries, yes. French fries, no. I don't know if you guys remember freedom fries. Do you remember freedom fries? No. So when France, was it the Iraq invasion? Was it 2003? Yeah, it was, right? So when I think that, you know, old Europe, New Europe, Donald Rumsfeld, New Europe was Eastern Europe, old Europe was France and Germany, like voted against participating in the Iraq War. And so then it was like, fuck the French. It's not French fries, it's freedom fries.
They do freedom toast?
They didn't do freedom toast, I don't think. I don't know.
Not as popular, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. French toast is pretty popular, but then you have Texas toast anyway, don't you?
Yeah.
So you kind of, I don't know. Don't ask me, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know about this right-wing insanity. All right. So everything communicates. Why does everything communicate? Because everything relates. Everything communicates with everything else because everything relates to everything else. And then what is it that they're communicating? They're communicating mental meanings, which is kind of interesting. Right? So you could just say that they're communicating meanings, but no, he says mental meanings. Meaning, it's what it means to us. And what it means to us also involves what it means in itself. So, again, the title of the essay is important, Language as Such, and the Language of Man. All right, so those are, it's a distinction, but it's a distinction that's established only in order to relate the two. In other words, this is why, like, when we were talking about Kant earlier in this semester, the thing in itself problem is not really a problem. This is like a weird misunderstanding of Kant. There is only a distinction between the thing in itself and the thing for us in order to help us understand what it means. Right? It's not like some hypostasization of the thing in itself. Similarly, language as such. Right? So we can understand everything as a kind of language, is what he says. Existence of language is not only coextensive with all the areas of human mental expression, which language is always in one sense or another inherent, but with absolutely everything. There is no event or thing in either animate or inanimate nature that does not in some way partake of language, for it is in the nature of all to communicate their mental meanings. Okay, so the consciousness, the greater or lesser degree of consciousness that is apparently or really involved in such communication. So we have, more recently, we have thing theory. We have object-oriented ontology. We have thing theory. We have the idea that everything, that there's a kind of panpsychism that's made a comeback now, that everything is conscious. It's like David Lynch. It's like the log lady. Everything is conscious. Yeah, no, kind of. I mean, that works for like a film or like a TV show. Like it works as a surrealist art object, but I don't know if it really works theoretically. But panpsychism has made a comeback, which is that everything is conscious. Why is everything conscious? Because we can be conscious of everything. And because we can be conscious of everything, everything must partake of consciousness. All that is asserted here is that all expression, insofar as it is a communication of mental meaning, is to be classed as language. And expression, by its whole innermost nature, is certainly to be understood only as language. On the other hand, to understand a linguistic entity, it is always necessary to ask of which mental entity it is the direct expression. That is to say, the German language, for example, is by no means the expression of everything that we could theoretically express through it, but is the direct expression of that which communicates itself in it. The itself is a mental entity. It is therefore obvious at once that the mental entity that communicates itself in language is not language itself, but rather something to be distinguished from it. The view that the mental essence of a thing consists precisely in its language, this view, taken as a hypothesis, is the great abyss into which all linguistic theory threatens to fall, and to survive suspended precisely over this abyss is its task. The distinction between a mental entity and the linguistic entity in which it communicates is the first stage of any study of linguistic theory, and this distinction seems so unquestionable that it is rather the frequently asserted identity between mental and linguistic being that constitutes a deep and incomprehensible paradox, the expression of which is to be found in the ambiguity of the word logos. Nevertheless, this paradox has a place as a solution at the center of linguistic theory, but remains a paradox and insoluble if placed at the beginning. All right, so he's introducing here a distinction that's important, which is the distinction between entity and identity. So, entity is not equivalent to identity. So entity refers to being, and identity refers to becoming. Entity refers to being, identity refers to becoming. In other words, and we'll add the term self-identity to this. So it's how does something become identical with itself? So an entity is just what exists. And the question is, how does something that exists attain identity with itself? How does it become self-identical? So it's not its mere identity, but it's identity. So it becomes. And he's saying that's what the term logos seems to refer to. But logos seems to refer to this process by which an entity attains self-identity. And again, logos, we are in the theological domain of logos. Okay, so there's that, entity and identity, but then as regards language itself. So as regards language itself, then it would be this relation between a mental and linguistic entity through logos is how it achieves identity.
Is he introducing the word logos, or is there like a lineage of this word?
Oh, it's biblical. Logos, the logos, right? So like the Word of God, basically, logos. And so I mentioned that he moves between Jewish and Christian theological references, right? So the identity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is logos. In other words, how can God be three things and still be one thing? That's understood as logos. Don't ask me, I just work here. All right, so linguistic theory, we can also think about it. He's using this different language, but we encountered in the mimetic faculty, we did encounter the more familiar language of semiotics. There's signifier and signified. Right. So the signified is an entity, right? And then the signifier is also an entity. And it's their identity that constitutes the language. Right, the signified and the signifier, the mental and linguistic.
It is their what that constitutes language? Their relation?
Yeah, and that would be the logos. Right, so language would be the identity of signified and signifier.
Language is the same as identity.
Yeah. So again, language, he says it can't be the beginning. Can't be the beginning. It's got to be the result, not the beginning. In other words, linguistic theory for him is how signifier and signified or mental and linguistic meaning become identical in language. You can't posit it at the beginning, because if you posit it at the beginning, then you're leaving out the process by which it happens. And yet we do place it at the beginning, don't we? Meaning that's the Adamic language. In other words, linguistic theory can't, in order to get out of this insoluble paradox, it can't posit it at the beginning, and yet our first theory of language is Adamic language, it is theological, and it does place it at the beginning. Right, but then we have to reverse it. Right? Otherwise, we can't have a theory of language. We just have the idea that, again, God names everything, but we don't know the names of things. I will also mention, because of Duns Scotus, nominalism. So that's like again, a theological, philosophical thing. So nominalism is particularism. Right? Nominalism is particularism, meaning that nominalism is that each of God's creation has its own nomos, has its own like rule or law, follows its own logic. Like every particular aspect of God's creation has its own logic, and only God knows that logic. So nominalism. So they're all unified in the mind of God, but the way we experience it, everything has its own meaning, its own purpose, its own existence, its own logic. That's nominalism. And by the way, that's where we've gone with postmodernism. We've gone into nominalism. We've gone back into nominalism. Particularism as opposed to universalism. That's not what Benjamin's going to do. No. Task of world politics, his method must be called nihilism. That's not nominalism. Nominalism is the particularism, which is everything's itself. No, everything's participating in a historical process of capitalism. Everything's not just itself. Okay, let's take a short break.
So I think I need to get out.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not quite
Let's turn to the notes that you guys posted.
It's like a reference, like no. So I don't want to like update it.
So my volunteers were Lena and Jack.
And we split it up. I didn't have to. I'll watch it.
All right, so you did split it up.
Yes, we did.
Okay, so let's start with the languages section, languages man. Questions that came up. I will also say, he comes around to the idea of mediation. Right, so that's really the question, is mediation, meaning language, logos, as mediation. Right, so that. So I mentioned social relations, and we talked about alienation, but there's also the question of mediation, meaning how are social relations mediated, and that they might be mediated in forms that then are alienated, like technology. We could also say reified. So, all right, so religion, metaphysics, science are forms of mediation. And, for example, technology. And so when forms of mediation are understood as alienated or reified, putting more of a fine point on it, namely thingified. Right, so that's, we wouldn't say that God is a reification. God is an alienation, but God's not a reification. Reification brings in this question of time, temporality, process versus thing. Right, so a thing seems static. And that introduces a very specific issue with respect to capitalism, which is the way time is self-contradictory in capitalism, where things appear to be part of a process. All that is solid melts into air, but also congealed, the commodity fetishism, the congealing of the value of labor in things. Right, so it's simultaneously vaporizing and ossifying. Right, capitalism is doing both of those things, and reification speaks to that latter aspect. Okay, yeah, Lynn, would you want to emphasize from your notes?
I was thinking like he was talking about inanimate objects like rocks and like
Lamps.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of the perspective of communication.
Uh-huh.
How they are communicated, and language is itself like what do you say? Like it's his perspective that that inanimate object or like a material that doesn't have like a consciousness has its own like language or like medium of expression, and that is its own existence itself.
That's
so
right.
Language is equals to existence, he says, but he didn't elaborate that
Right.
part. And
Right, the medium of expression.
yeah, the expression language in itself.
Right, so something expresses itself, right? But again, that brings in this issue of entity and identity. So something expresses itself, so something, an entity expresses itself, but in expressing itself, it attains identity, right? So then the language with which it expresses itself is how it achieves identity with itself. And so it does so, it expresses itself through a medium of expression. So now, does something mediate itself? Kind of, but it mediates itself only through its own self-expression. Right, that's what it means for it to communicate.
Yeah, so how come, like, it's a human perspective that an object communicates
Right,
with the human?
right.
So it's kind of, it felt like paradoxical in sense of perspective of the existence.
Right. Okay, so we're going to encounter the term aura, but in some motifs in Baudelaire. So we're not going to be dealing with aura in the work of art because we're not reading the work of art in this class. The work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So we're going to be dealing with aura in a different sense. And the way Benjamin puts it is that an object returns the gaze or opens its eyes under the gaze of the subject. Right, so again, if you recall the subject-object dialectic, the issue is the process by which the thing becomes an object. So the thing becomes an object in relation to the subject, but there is a thing. There is a thing. But it becomes an object. And we only know the object, we only know the thing as an object. So we only know the thing as it communicates, would be how we put it here in this instance. Right, so, and again, communicate even suggests a kind of communing. We've had that term, that the way he puts it is that we only know communally, that was into the planetarium. Communally, that means by communing with. Right, so if we just keep in mind that the subject-object dialectic doesn't mean that there's no thing. There is a thing. Thing becomes an object. And actually that's the way in which the subject becomes a subject. Right? So objectification is also subjectification. So the subject only becomes a subject through this process of objectifying things, but it is things that are being objectified. So why is that important? We only know things in our relation to them, but it is a relation to something. I think that the difficulty with Kant, with these sort of Kantian ideas, is that it becomes a kind of solipsism. It becomes like just mere subjectivism. It becomes like, it's all in our head or something. It's like, no, it's a relation, and therefore there is a relation to the thing. But we know that relation only in the way that we're relating. We know the thing only in how we're relating to it. And why is that important? Because it changes. The way we relate to things changes. So our social relations, our relations change. And that changing relation is history. Now, why this is important is because translation is part of history. Translation is part of history. A lot of this discussion in languages such as the language of man we've encountered previously with Bergson. So matter is an aggregate of images. What are images? Images are things that are perceived, right? And what is perception? The interaction of images, right? So there's a kind of a circuit of perception. So we are perceiving something, but that perception is itself an interaction. And it's a relation, right? Relations are active, practical. Relations are interactions. So we interact with things. We relate to things, we interact with things. We relate to others, we interact with others. We relate to ourselves, we interact with ourselves. Right, so I think that the reason that we read the Bergson is to help clear up some of this. Because remember how Bergson begins? He says he's going to try to overcome dualism by being frankly dualistic. Why? Because you need these different moments. Like during the break I was talking with Pablo about dualism and monism. You need dualism in order to have different moments. The problem with monism is that it collapses the moments. It gives you no way of discussing the moments. Meaning, why have we ever been dualistic? Right, so we need a rational concept of the object of God. We need a rational comprehension of why dualism has been so pervasive across history through human cultures. It's not like a mistake. Obviously, we're trying to express something with that dualism. So again, like the thing with postmodernism, it's like we're supposed to be anti-Cartesian and anti-dualism and blah, 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 blah. No. You need the dualism. Otherwise you can't think anything. Because you can't have the different moments without the dualism. You need non-identity. You need the non-identity of entity and identity. Otherwise, you can't think about how these things change. Right? Otherwise, everything would just be what it was. Again, we'd be in Eden or paradise. Everything would just be what it is. But it isn't. It changes. And again, if the reason I did the mimetic faculty with you guys today before we got into it here is, again, language changes. Right? This is a moving proposition. This isn't like a once and for all thing.
thinking of the perspective thing. Like,
Uh-huh.
just not clearing my like.
Right, so perception, yeah, if we use that language, we kind of started out, again, with, paradise or Eden, meaning when everything was identical, or really not even identical, it just was what it was, and it spoke what it is. Everything was identical with its expression, but it wasn't identical in the sense of becoming identical, it just was itself. Everything was itself. No longer. Right, so it seems like once you introduce time and history, then things become non-identical to themselves. Signifier and signified are non-identical. Mental and linguistic meaning are non-identical. And then communication or language is about that non-identity. It's about that abyss or paradox. And that's generative, right? In other words, meaning is that. It's generative of meaning. It's not like, oh, that prevents meaning. No, it generates meaning. That's separation. If you think of Benjamin as being in a dialogue with Romanticism, it helps. Meaning, Romanticism is all about loss of meaning, and we can never understand, and we can never communicate, and things are untranslatable. Things are untranslatable. Untranslatable. No, because everything is a translation. So things are translatable. They're not untranslatable. They're completely translatable. If they weren't translatable, they wouldn't exist. Right, so it's very different from this romantic idea that posits existence as beyond translatability, or beyond communication, or beyond expression. No, things only exist insofar as they express themselves, they communicate themselves, they appear. Right? The essence must appear. We talked about that. The essence must appear. Hegel. The essence must appear. I think we did, with the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, the essence must appear, meaning it's not that it's not the Platonic idea, which is that essences are eternal and true, they're unchanging, but we never know them, the noumenal realm, we never know them, we only know the deceptive appearances, the phenomena. No, appearances are essential. We do know the truth of things through their appearance. It's a total reversal of that. Ancient metaphysics, which is based in theology, which is based on the idea that we can never know the mind of God. Which, up to and including, we can never know our own minds. Because once you say that you can never know the mind of God, it also means you can't know your own mind. No. We can. We do. We must. And again, the question is, why do we posit this thing that's unknowable, the mind of God? What is that about? Why do we do that? And yet we also seek it. We also try to attain it. We don't just say we can't know it and then just leave it at that. We can't know it, and then that becomes the divine mystery that we constantly are exploring. All right, so it's generative. Again, the gap, we might say, is generative. It's not like just an impasse.
What is generative? Translation.
Yeah.
But if you say that if it's not translatable, it doesn't exist. But it might also exist, like without our knowledge in nature.
Right. But it's not unknowable as such. It's not like inherently unknowable. Meaning we may not know it yet, but it doesn't mean that it's unknowable, like definitively. at least, again, a theory of language for Benjamin is a theory of expressibility, expression. It's about what can be expressed, what is expressed. Let me, if I can, we're running out of time. Maybe we'll come back to some points. Let's look at the translation issue, because I think that this is potentially, again, it rubs us the wrong way. And what that means is that we're always going to be reading the exact opposite into Benjamin that he means. That's the danger. The danger is that we're going to think that Benjamin is just saying what we think, and no. He's challenging us. And like I said, one of the basic things he's challenging is this romantic idea of untranslatability. In the appreciation of a work of art or an art form, consideration of the receiver never proves fruitful. Oh, so it's not reception theory either. Oh, okay, it's not reception theory either. Not only is any reference to a certain public or its representatives misleading, but even the concept of an ideal receiver is detrimental in the theoretical consideration of art, since all it posits is the existence and nature of man as such. Art, in the same way, posits man's physical and spiritual existence, but in none of its works is it concerned with his response. No poem is intended for the reader, no picture for the beholder, no symphony for the listener. Is a translation meant for readers who do not understand the original? All right, let's unpack this and why he says no poem is intended for the reader, no picture for the beholder, no symphony for the listener. If we bring in this idea of non-identity, it's helpful. Meaning, a poem is meant to change the reader, a picture is meant to change the beholder, a symphony is meant to change the listener. Right? So the ideal receiver is detrimental because, to quote Marx, the point is to change it. Meaning what the poem does as a poem, what the painting, the picture does as such, what the symphony does or what music does as such, is to transform the reader or the viewer or the listener. Otherwise, it wouldn't be doing anything. Otherwise, it would have no substance. Right, so a translation meant for readers who do not understand the original. So all writing and all reading is a translation. That's important. It's not as if there's anything that's untranslated. Everything is translated. So he says, this would seem to explain adequately the divergence of their standing in the realm of art between the original and the translation. Moreover, it seems to be the only conceivable reason for saying the same thing repeatedly. For what does a literary work say? What does it communicate? It tells very little to those who understand it. Its essential quality is not statement or the imparting of information. Yet any translation which intends to perform a transmitting function cannot transmit anything but information, hence something inessential. This is the hallmark of bad translations. But we do not generally regard as the essential substance of a literary work what it contains in addition to information, as even a poor translator will admit, the unfathomable, the mysterious, the poetic, something that a translator can reproduce only if he is also a poet. This actually is the cause of another characteristic of inferior translation, which consequently we may define as the inaccurate transmission of the inessential content. This will be true whenever a translation undertakes to serve the reader. So again, it's not to serve the reader, it's to affect the reader, it's to change the reader. However, if it were intended for the reader, the same would have to apply to the original. If the original does not exist for the reader's sake, how could the translation be understood on the basis of this premise? All right, so part of it, he's a German-speaking person. So I think that you raised the question of whether, was it something that Benjamin wrote originally in French?
Like he collaborated with the French translator on the artwork in the age of mechanical reproduction. Right?
That's right. So generally speaking, translators usually translate things into their own language. Okay, so the reason that I emphasize that point is that the task of the translator, what the translator is meant to do. So he is German and he's translating French literature. And when we get to the surrealism essay, this will be more apparent. But he's trying to make an intervention into German literature by way of French literature, meaning he is trying to affect not only German literature, but the German language itself. All right, so the idea is that when you translate Baudelaire into German, you're changing the German language, actually. Because you're introducing like French thoughts into German language, and therefore you're changing the language that you're translating into. You're changing the destination language, and that is his intention. So his intention is to, he has kind of an overall mission, which is to affect not only German criticism, but German literature with respect to modernism. So it's the kind of modernism and romanticism dialogue. So German literature, German criticism tends to be romantic. He wants to bring French modernism into the German mind, you might say. German spirit, German consciousness. And that's why he thinks it's essential to translate. Now, he's not the first to translate Baudelaire by any means. Right, so famous poets have translated Baudelaire into German already. So the question is, why does a new translation or another translation need to happen? Times change. Right, in other words, history. So every reading changes the original as a function of historical time. Every translation changes the original as a function of historical time. So things need to be translated. They must be translated. Indeed, they must be retranslated over and over again. Now, here's finally the most bizarre proposition that he makes, which is that the original doesn't become itself until it's translated into another language. Meaning, maybe the essential Baudelaire is in its German form. So it's the exact opposite of the idea of untranslatability.
So this idea that the point will change, yeah?
And also that something becomes itself, meaning something has a life in history in which it's constantly unfolding its meaning and becoming itself. So it's the romantic idea is that as things exist in time, they lose meaning. Like from their original moment, they so become depleted of meaning, as with the passage of historical time. The idea is that no, things gain meaning in historical time. The passage of historical time gives more meaning to things. And translation is part of that process in which things increase their meaning as they continue to live on historically. Right, so paintings from 100 years ago mean more now than they did in their original moment. Works of literature mean more now than they did in their original moment. Now, that can sound nice, but there's another reason for that, which is that they have an effect. In other words, otherwise, if they only had the meaning that they had at their point of origin, then you'd basically be saying that they have no effect, that they don't do anything, that they're kind of mere representations. They're kind of lesser than the original. That, I don't know, Kafka's like describing Viennese life in turn of the century Austria, and that, of course, it's just a pale imitation of the real life. No, art does something. Art is more than life. Art is not less than life. Art is more than life. In other words, life in turn of the century Austria becomes itself only through its literary expression or its artistic expression. So something in its mere entity, in its mere existence, is not really itself. Right? So again, there's something essential about art. Otherwise, we would prioritize life over art, and then art would become some kind of pale imitation, an essential thing. So we're dealing with the mimetic faculty. Mimesis changes things, meaning mimesis is essential. It's not like, okay, you have things, and then mimesis is just a sort of inessential adjunct. No, in fact, things only become themselves through that mimetic process, including expression through language and art. Right, so art is not less than life, art is more than life. And life only becomes itself through its objectification. Through its externalization, its objectification, its spiritualization. That's the other term, the geistic. Right? So we only know ourselves through externalizations. So, again, the romantic idea is this. Are you ready for this? Here's the real cosmological thing. Are we less than the animals? We might think so. We might think that we're less than the animals. No, we're more than the animals, of course. All human cultures have known that, always. Always. Of course we're more than animal. And yet we're more than animal precisely in the way that we seem to be less than animal. Meaning animals exist, and they just are in the fullness of their existence. They simply exist, and they live, and they don't have the alienation and this weird separation and like loss of meaning, right? No, that's how we're more than the animals, although we're given to think that we're less than the animals. And this goes for history too. It always looks like the past was more full and we're more empty. That somehow in the past people really lived and they really had a full kind of existence and a cultural reality, that now we have this kind of alienated, sort of depleted meaning of loss of existence. No. Of course our existence is more than what people did in the past. It's sort of obviously the case. We do more than they did. We relate in more complex ways than they did. We've developed. We've changed. We've gone beyond them. But we experience that as a loss. And maybe that's the part of it. In other words, maybe inevitably, and this is the Hegelianism, meaning that perhaps inevitably we have to experience every historical advance or gain as a loss. And we've been telling ourselves that story ever since the beginning, expulsion from the Garden of Eden. We had our true existence and we lost it. We've been telling ourselves that forever. Make America great again. When was that? Oh, 30 years ago. Like, things were better then than they are now. Really? Yeah, but 30 years ago they didn't think so. 30 years ago they thought things were better 30 years before that. And on and on and on. Okay. So again, how do we introduce history into the mix, and how do we get at history? Well, translation. Translation is a record of history, of historical change. Right, so we don't just have different translations, we have a history of translation. Let me turn to your notes.
There's a lot. my first reaction was just like, I think this is the most optimistic I've ever read that community, which was kind of interesting. He seemed like there was some real hope. And I guess going off of what you were just talking about, how like, oh, it's a misconception to think that he had something that was lost. I mean, how does that jive with the idea of like pure language and the broken vessel? Like, he doesn't explicitly say it, but the idea of there being a broken vessel implies that the vessel wasn't broken at some point. And I get to this in a later question, but that goes into like your thing about fragments and fragments of like whole that was broken or constituent parts that are in the process of coming together.
Right.
And I guess, yeah, and the first question there was sort of like, how can we make sense of this with this sort of like historical materialist account of history? It seems very simplistically easy to be able to graft it on to a kind of vulgar Marxist, like, and we're all—
Lukács would not be vulgar Marxism. Lukács would not be
Yeah.
vulgar Marxism. It would be the opposite of vulgar Marxism. I mean, it is very Lukácsian, and it is like, you know, once you kind of get the thing, then it seems like, oh yeah, this is just Marxism. But then, you know, but he is trying to develop it to greater understanding. Meaning, what do we even mean by like intersubjectivity, for example, right? And, you know, so the question would be, why do we experience things as a broken vessel? Why do we tell ourselves these stories like the Tower of Babel? Right? Because these are things that we tell ourselves. These are ways that we experience things. And so that's really the question. So explain more, though, like maybe unpack that a little bit about the simplistic or the grafted.
I mean,
I wasn't sure.
Sometimes I just feel like it's very easy to do like a comic version of Marx's history, and I was like, it's easy after reading this to be like, okay, like we're alienated from language, and that's why we're divided, and Benjamin seems to be saying there's pure language, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we weren't alienated and we could all hold hands and sing kumbaya in this beautiful vessel that once we're no longer alienated from language, we're all able to, be friends. And I am put off by how simplistic.
But does he say, does he?
No, he doesn't.
Yeah, does he pose that?
He doesn't explicitly say it.
Right.
But pure language, broken vessel coming together, it has this optimism that I think points, you know, if he wanted to say that, he would have said it, but it's certainly an optimism that points towards, you know, something good, a possibility of something coming together.
Right, so pure language, the pure language idea. So if he starts the essay with this idea of the essential and the inessential, and I think that that's where pure comes in. In other words, it's not about purging everything that is impure. It's about getting to the essence of things. And of course the essence changes, right? So, in other words, that's like, we have to ask what pure language means. We can't just say, okay, pure language means what? Language with all of history expelled from it? No, because he doesn't think that that can happen. Right, so it's really about what's essential, and that's a changing proposition. It's not like, you know, that can never be achieved. But it is a kind of a necessary thought, we might put it that way. You know, meaning, what does it mean that we use language to communicate and we treat it as a flawed or broken form of communication?
No, I'm not going to answer that, but I have another question.
Yeah.
Can we please clarify what is pure language for Benjamin? Because this whole time I've been thinking that it's like...
Are you talking about it in the translation piece or in the language as such piece? In the translation piece.
He says it is the totality of all languages supplementing each other in their intentions, or something along those lines, I think.
So it's like the sum of all languages. But like, where does it originate? Does it come from God? Because it's Well, I think it shouldn't come from God because we do materialism. But also it's Benjamin, so it's like mystic. So it's, I don't know what's like where does this
But wait a second.
pure
Wait a
language
second.
come from?
It is still God. It is still coming from God because God is everything, right? So, in other words, there's no. It's not like God is something other than material. No,
Okay.
right? It's not. That's something. And then in terms of the totality of language, let's think about what totality means in that instance. So, so you don't have the actual. What's the let's see.
Sorry.
The greater language.
That part.
All right, let's find it. That's 78. I think it's in that same spot. Let's look at the actual spot.
He first uses the phrase pure language on 74. Only by the totality of their intentions supplementing each other pull in pure language.
All right, hold on.
A little further up before Brock's.
Oh, I see. Oh, bread and bread, right. Pan and bread, yeah. Wait, hold on. Where's it getting away from me? Oh, there it is. Okay, all right. Ah, here we go. All right, this is good. Wherein resides the relatedness of two languages apart from historical considerations? Certainly not in the similarity between works of literature or words. Rather, all supra-historical kinship of languages rests in the intention underlying each language as a whole. An intention, however, which no single language can attain by itself, but which is realized only by the totality of their intentions supplementing each other, pure language. While all individual elements of foreign languages, words, sentences, structure, are mutually exclusive, these languages supplement one another in their intentions. Without distinguishing the intended object from the mode of intention, no firm grasp of the basic law of a philosophy of language could be achieved. The words brok and pan intend the same object, but the modes of this intention are not the same. It is owing to these modes that the word brok means something different to a German than the word pan to a Frenchman. But these words are not interchangeable for them, and in fact they strive to exclude each other. As to the intended object, however, the two words mean the very same thing. Okay. Excuse me, let me continue this. While the modes of intention in these two words are in conflict, intention and object of intention complement each other, complement each of the two languages from which they are derived. There the object is complementary to the intention. In the individual unsupplemented languages, meaning is never found in relative independence, as in individual words or sentences. Rather, it is in a constant state of flux until it is able to emerge as pure language from the harmony of all the various modes of intention. Until then, it remains hidden in the languages. If, however, these languages continue to grow in this manner until the end of their time, it is translation which catches fire on the eternal life of the works and the perpetual renewal of language. Translation keeps putting the hallowed growth of languages to the test. How far removed is their hidden meaning from revelation? How close can it be brought by the knowledge of this remoteness? Okay, so it's got two instances of pure language there. And so it seems like pure language is in the intention, not in the actual language. And that there are two different intentions. There's the intention towards the object, where it's trying to express the object. But then there's the intention, which is the meaning. And that's why he's making a very counterintuitive point.
Meaning of what?
Meaning to the, like he's saying, why does brok mean something different to the German than pan to the Frenchman? That seems odd.
About what revelation he talks then, if everything is relativized, yeah, like
Relativized?
Yeah, like, or he cannot take, well, if he says that for German, yeah, Brot means one thing, for French, tongue means another thing, yeah, so we measure like these intentions of languages one against each other in translation, yeah? We are not measuring them against some pure proto-Adamic language, yeah?
Right. That's right. Okay, so again, what I started out with today on the social relations point. So what he's saying is that maybe German and French are different languages because in some, however small way, they reflect different relations. Right? And yet, they all express relations. Right? So even though the word is referring to the same thing, we have these two different words, and those two different words are not just, I think he says, in isolation, like it's not just words, it's also within the whole language. And so the whole language expresses relations to things. So it's not just a reference to the word, it's a reference to the relation. And of course, why are French and German different languages at all? Because there are different histories. Right? There are different histories in these two languages. And when you're translating, that's what you're relating. You're relating two languages, but you're relating two histories of language. That's the word superhistorical. I realize we're not there yet. Later in the semester, Nietzsche will be reading. The one Nietzsche that we will read is The Use and Abuse of History for Life. And his categories there are the unhistorical, the historical, and the suprahistorical. So the unhistorical is just a kind of perpetual present. It's like an animal existence where you don't know the difference between one moment and the next. The historical is how we make sense of temporality and change. And then the suprahistorical is the motivation by which we change what history itself means. So he is throwing that word in here for a second because he's saying, again, we're not just having these two histories, like, I don't know, as if French history just exists and as if German history just exists, that they're both in a process of becoming, and that translation is the meeting of those two processes of becoming. All right, so it's not just like the past. Like, it's not like, oh, well, Germans and French have different pasts, and that's why there are two different histories. No. It's rather they partake in different processes of becoming that nonetheless are related to each other and do meet.
Like this word revelation for me is triggering because it's not triggering like
Yeah, I know.
because it means like a certain point of reference, yeah. How removed to the hidden meaning from revelation.
Right, so revelation, I mentioned before the theological idea of revelation, which is that God is always revealing his intention. Right, one reason why we can never know God's intention is that it's always in a process of being revealed. In other words, it's changing. And we have that in terms of like the Bible. Yes, this is like Western-centric, Eurocentric, whatever it is. Judeo-Christian tradition, yeah, it's the Bible. God changes his mind. Or did he change his mind? Or did he only change what he revealed to us? In other words, he asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but then he's like, no, I don't want you to do that. Right? So does that mean that God changed his mind, or did he always have this in mind, but he just changed what he revealed to us? Right? So revelation is connected to history. And maybe I realized that we didn't do one thing, sorry. We didn't do the types of history, Jesus. And I do mean Jesus. Because I think this will help. We have everything on the syllabus for a reason. Okay, so he's got the three kinds of history. He's got natural history, cosmogony, and universal history. Okay, so natural history, the developmental stages of phenomena. So again, how things have appeared. Cosmogony, divine history. Okay, so cosmogony, what does that mean? It means the origin of the universe, or the origin of everything in the universe, the origin of the cosmos. And then universal history is linear causality from the standpoint of which natural history becomes the history of creation and universal history becomes revelation. That's what made me think of Revelation. I was like, wait, we've had Revelation for this week, and so we have, okay, we do have like Revelation. Natural history exists only as cosmogony or as the history of creation. Herder's conception of this is mistaken regarded from an earthly standpoint, but the earth itself is a world historical individual because human beings live on it. The correspondence between phenomena is valid, not just for the cosmos, but also for terrestrial nature, for which the correspondence in universal history is also relevant, as well as for anthropos as a phenomenon, for example, as a sexual being up to the limits of history. Natural history does not extend to mankind any more than does universal history. It knows only the individual. Man is neither a phenomenon nor an effect, but a created being. Okay, let's unpack that. Because of course, a self-created being. Right, the reason that we're not just a phenomenon or an effect is that we produce ourselves. Okay, so universal history is the revelation of that self-creation. Right, so, yeah, this is not, I don't think this was published yet. This is unpublished yet. So this is just like a little note, a little weird little note to himself that's more or less meaningful, but it helps us a little bit because just the distinction of developmental stages of phenomena versus origin of phenomena. So we encountered this in the mimetic faculty, ontogeny and phylogeny. Right? Origin and development. There's a reason why we distinguish those things. And why we distinguish those things is that they're two different ways of looking at history. Right? One way of looking at history is where do things come from? What's their origin? And another way of thinking about history is how do they develop? Because if things are, especially man, is self-created, then are we saying that the universe is constantly being created, or is it being developed? Right, so it basically brings us into this question of, at any given moment of existence, is it just as it exists, or as it came into being, and as it's becoming further different from what it is? Right, so, natural history doesn't look self-created in the same way as universal history. Meaning, if you look at like geological history, when humans didn't exist, is that history? What do we mean by that? We're only really interested in geological history insofar as it tells us about our origins. Right, so again, you know, we posit a history, and this is something that we'll encounter when we do Nietzsche. We posit a history as if it exists without us, but that's us telling us that story. Right, so because there wasn't really history before there were humans. There was stuff. Again, the very Kantian idea. There's the sensuous manifold, there's stuff, there's the flux of matter and energy, but there's no development. no development of appearances, because of course there are no appearances. Everything just exists. Okay, so coming back to it, the pure language idea. French and German are different languages, but they didn't develop in isolation from each other either. That's an important point. Meaning French is a Latinate language and German is its own. You know, there are the Germanic languages versus the Latin languages. But part of the national separation in Europe had to do with the conquest of Europe by different German tribes. Meaning French is only French because of how it's no longer Roman Latin, and therefore as it's affected by the German migrations. And similarly, German wouldn't be German if it hadn't been affected by the Roman Empire and Latin, etc. English, by the way, since we're talking in English and we're teaching the class in English, English is just a sort of Frenchified German. That's what English is. English is Frenchified German. It's sort of a Germanic language that has a hell of a lot of Latinate admixture. Right. So, again, pure language, it's what language is becoming. Right. So, again, the fragment idea, I think, was on point. Meaning, we could think of it as Tower of Babel, you know, as broken pieces, or we could think of it as in a process of unification. Have we encountered the Esperanto yet? Okay. Yeah, because he brings up Esperanto, which is this invented language, right? And he's like, well, you can't do universal history as a kind of Esperanto. I think we'll get there. It might be on the concept of history. It might be at the very end of the semester. I thought that we might have encountered it already. That in other words, universal history isn't like a sort of mere voluntary construct. It's not like, oh, we'll make the world unified by inventing a language that everybody can speak. Meaning it actually has to come together historically. And the motivation for that is what he's trying to get at with the pure language idea. Yes, different though in the sense that it's not like God is making this happen or God started us out this way, but rather, we're doing it. Right, so, and translation is part of that process. That's really the point. Right, so that's one of the reasons why things must be translated. Things must be translated because they must attain a new meaning through translation. And also, more importantly, because they are about languages affecting each other in this way. Because like I said, the point is not just to realize the meaning of Baudelaire, but to realize the meaning of the French language that can only be realized in German, and vice versa. Meaning German literature must be translated into French, not because the work itself, only the work itself, needs to realize itself, but because the language needs to realize itself by being translated into another language. I feel like we have this, 60s grunge, I don't know what it is, we don't like the word pure or something, but if we think of it as distilling the essence, in other words, what is it that's translated? When you're translating, what is it that's actually being translated? That's what pure means. It means sort of the essence, that comes through. It's a purification process. It's not like purity. It's not like purity is ever attained. It's more like when you're translating, you're engaged in this kind of purification process. And then the motivation for that, what it is, this essence that you think that you're translating or bringing across.
So it can be a form of enlightenment?
Sure. Yeah.
Talks about the light shining through.
The light shining through. And again, this is where the term Erscheinung is so important, right? Because the appearance, it's not a representation, it's a shining through. Right, it's not like an inaccurate picture. Right, it's an expression, it's a shining through, and in some ways, again, it's a translation. Or it's the other word they use is transmission. All right. Hopefully we did justice. Kept you guys late. Next week, Baudelaire. Pace yourselves. Paris of the Second Empire and Baudelaire. It's a long slog, but it's very good.